Okay, it is noon. Good morning and afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Tony Whalen. I am the project manager for the Partnership for Food Protection and will serve as the moderator for today's call. Today's call is scheduled for 90 minutes, with the first portion of the call dedicated to presentations. Following the presentations, we will open up the phone lines and take questions from our callers during a question and answer session. We are recording today's call. I've already started the recording. If you do not wish to participate, please disconnect now. Okay. And for our speakers today, we have Aaron Bubb, the Division Chief with Division of Agronomics and Regional Services, Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. We also have Jennifer Erickson, a Regulatory Policy Analyst, Center for Veterinary Medicine here at the FDA. And we also have Austin Farrell, Animal Feed Program Coordinator, South Carolina Department of Agriculture. And we also have Hollis Glenn, Division Director, Division of Inspection and Consumer Services, Colorado Department of Agriculture. Of course, I messed up my thing already. Okay, and so I would also like to introduce to you Barbara Cassens, co-chairperson for the Partnership for Food Protection Governing Council. Go ahead, Barbara, if you can hear me.
Okay, Tony. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar. I'm also the Director of the Office of Partnerships, which is an FDA Office of Regulatory Affairs, and I've met many of you at various conferences. And unfortunately, we got a surprise with our COVID pandemic. We were hoping to hold our PFP meeting this year face-to-face. I know many of you were disappointed with that because we haven't seen each other for a while. So we decided to do a series of webinars, and this is the fifth in our series, our final webinar, to address just COVID pandemic challenges that have been experienced and lessons learned and how people overcame those challenges. And today's topic is animal foods. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague and co-chair, Pat Kennelly, to give you a few remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara, and good morning and welcome everybody. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. As Barbara mentioned, we certainly were hoping to have our annual meeting this last year, but because of the events associated with the pandemic, we were not able to do so. So we picked the next best thing, which is, of course, moving virtual. And we've had a series of our webinars from manufactured food and retail food focus to produce, and, of course, animal food being as equally important. We wanted to make sure that we included that in the mix. So I think today we're going to hear from some great speakers talking about some of the work and innovative approaches they've done to continue to ensure the safety of the animal food supply, during this COVID pandemic. And so I'm very much looking forward to it. And again, thanks for joining us. I would like to turn it over to Sue Hayes for some opening remarks as well. And Sue, I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Pat. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the ASCO Board of Directors. We're very pleased to be a co-sponsor of today's session. The history of ASCO's involvement in the Partnership for Food Protection goes back several years, and it ties in well with our interest in developing and implementing an integrated food safety system. We know this is complex. We know it takes time to do it right. And we're just very pleased to be part of the conversations related to animal food safety. Today is a great opportunity to share real-life COVID experiences and lessons learned about conducting animal feed inspections during the pandemic. We want to give a special thank you to Aaron Bubb, Hollis Glenn, Austin Farrell, Jennifer Erickson, and everybody helping us behind the scenes. I hope you find value in these sessions and you have at least one takeaway that will help you in your job. Thank you for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you, Sue. All right, so we're going to go ahead and jump into our first presentation. And this is Aaron Bubb, Unexpected Opportunities Transcending the COVID Chaos. And Aaron, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Let me know when to advance to the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. I appreciate it. So just as a brief recap, because we haven't lived it enough, I thought I would share with you just some of the fall, kind of how this fell out for us. So in late January, we were actually asked to start prioritizing our Bureau's regulatory programs and the associated work in the event that a pandemic were to disrupt our work operations. The animal feed program was delegated to a high priority along with several other regulatory programs under our Bureau's jurisdiction. But what we couldn't have forecasted was the havoc that came from the mandated closings and the stay-at-home orders that ultimately came to be in the second half of March. So looking back on it, the county closings and the subsequent statewide closings happened within a period of about a week's time. On March 9th, there was governor-mandated restrictions to the Commonwealth travel and to all our work-related gatherings. County closings started out in the Philadelphia area, and within 1 week, all counties were closed. Non-essential businesses were ordered to close, and stay-at-home orders were initiated. Honestly, it felt like a row of dominoes were falling. Slide 2. So just a quick structure explanation here. So the Animal Feed Regulatory Program belongs to a division known as Agronomic and Regional Services. And this division has 2 program specialists for the agronomic programs and the feed program. We have 2 clerical, and we have 7 regions. So the regions is where our inspectors are located. And in those 7 regions, we have 6 supervisors, we have 14 inspectors with multi-inspection duties that include the animal feed, and we have 15 inspectors with plant health programs. Next slide. So March came in like a lamb, but it went out like a lion. First part, it's basically, it was a tale of 2 different worlds in March. The first part was business as usual. We were gearing up for spring. By the second half, we had major changes to our business model. Now, the feed program had been given a priority status, but the entire state was closed. The state employees were not supposed to be working outside of their house. Everybody was on telework status. And if you couldn't work from home, you were on a POC, or a paid office closing. So that's where the majority of our clerical work ended up for paid office closings. Field ops were suspended. Next slide, please. So how do we service the industries we regulate and the public that we protect? We are dedicated to being a viable member of the integrated food safety system. But as a leader, this was an area of struggle and conflict for me, and it remains so throughout the entire time. How do inspectors work from home for an indefinite amount of time? Inspectors generate work based on their field activities. No field inspections and no sampling will quickly dry up any work left to complete at their home. All we had were uncertainties. I had to help manage expectations, our own expectations, industry, the public, and our partners. So basically, we went into a case-by-case review for mission-critical fieldwork. Next slide. So amid the changes, some opportunities presented themselves to allow us to reevaluate and focus on seemingly minor actions that ultimately end up causing us to get off track from meeting our mission. We learned more about our own functionality and the importance of partnerships than we could have ever learned in a tabletop exercise. Next slide. So, annual inspector training, it's a big event in our world. We start planning our spring inspector training in December with logistics and with the speakers and with developing the information. But unfortunately, this year, the inspector training corresponded with the very first part of our COVID restrictions. The week that we experienced the majority of all things closing was the actual date of our inspector training. So with very little time, we basically took an entire week's worth of training. And within 2 days, the program specialists prepped and prepared to host over our Skype for Business application that we use. The new training agendas were developed, and we spread out the training over the course of the next 2 weeks. So we had everything scheduled, PowerPoints were created, slide sets were sent out, and the virtual training went off without a hitch. Next slide. No, not really, because I'm sure everybody has seen this meme. It popped up because it was an extremely popular meme to be sharing in March and April as everybody started to experience the conference call issues that come up. I will say that this is exactly what we experienced that first day that we did our initial virtual training. I sent this out to our inspection staff that week because it was too funny and it was too real not to share with them. We experienced just about every category on this bingo card. Everything from, we had a cat that just was constantly meowing during the very first virtual training we had. We had connection qualities, we had lagging slides, we had echoes when people talked. Callers couldn't mute themselves, and we had all kinds of background noise. And then when we did mute, the participants couldn't unmute so they could ask questions. It was honestly, it was a fiasco. Next slide, please. So basically, we had to learn the nuances of participating on a webinar. There is a need for training staff on how to conduct a virtual meeting platform, whether it's Skype, Zoom, WebEx, you name it. This was a clear indication that we should have offered training, we should have practiced for these types of virtual formats that we just had never anticipated and never took the time to do. But good news is, with some emergency on-the-job training, we actually delivered a pretty darn good inspector training, and it was critical to field operations and employee morale over the course of those first 2 weeks. And it was really only due to everyone's good nature, their patience and their humor, that we were able to carry this off. It ended up working out for us, but only because of the outstanding work by the presenters and the participants. Next slide. Now, because of the animal feed regulatory program standards that we are a part of, we had just recently completed the inspector training curriculum, and we had executed this onto a learning management system that maintains the curriculum. We had offered no training up to this point, but of course, the inspector training was going to provide all of this training, but we weren't able to do it because I wasn't able to bring that out virtually during that first 2 weeks. So it got pulled off the agenda. So we implemented this full suite of feed inspector training. It's an LMS system called Train. We refer to it as Train PA, and it's available through public health and emergency agencies. It was made available through some federal grants, and there are a lot of states that actually have this Train LMS system. So we were able to use it. It's free to us. So the basic and the advanced curriculums are assigned to the inspectors. They're all users. And the LMS manages their tracking and the completion of the courses. Next slide. But the inspectors hadn't had time to really try it. So, hey, there's no time like the present. And quite honestly, everybody just went full throttle on this. So what we have is this particular system will take you to an external training. So for instance, like SBA's PathLore, the ORA University, other sites that offer particular training courses that we have pulled into our curriculum. And then when the inspector is done with the actual presentation, they go back to train and they have to take an assessment. They have to pass a quiz, and then that will give them credit for that course. So in theory, everything works really well. It's pretty slick. But with 14 inspectors actually working through this for the first time, we experienced all kinds of feedback. We found some bugs. We found some things that weren't working. And honestly, had we not had this amount of time and energy put into this particular section, we would have never gotten the feedback that we had at the time. So in some ways, I felt very lucky that we were able to get such a great inspector turnout on this type of thing and get the feedback that we did to make it an even better system. Okay, next slide. So pushing the paperless agenda, we've been in a transition for well over a decade to try to get rid of paper forms, but they always linger. Some of them, you just can't quite capture them correctly in an electronic form, and there's always a lot of resistance to changing. So we had some mission critical work that had to be completed during this time where we were in a complete shutdown mode, working from home. So certain things like a notice of inspection, certain statements, signed verifications, record inspections, all converted to email correspondence. And for our time being, we actually stopped capturing signatures on forms. So not all of the changes that we made will stay permanent, mostly for legal purposes. However, it was a great proof of concept that adaptation can be made when necessary, and I'm actually looking forward to reviewing what can be changed on a permanent basis. Okay, next slide. And while our field operations were suspended, there was still mission critical work that needed to be completed. So, of course, PPE, personal protective equipment, became the limiting factor in much of what we could do safely. We had to get creative in procuring certain supplies, such as hand sanitizer. We were able to get large containers of hand sanitizer that needed to be broken down into small spray bottles, labeled, and sent out to the staff. N95 respirators were nowhere to be found for our purposes, obviously, and cloth face masks were not easy to obtain at this time. So we actually were able to receive cloth masks made by Pennsylvania inmates. And employees were encouraged to procure some of their own PPE if they could find it. Next slide. Technology. So with no landline hookups, no network cable to plug into meant we were all relying 100% on a very shaky 4G cellular card in our laptops or private Wi-Fi from our homes. And while it wasn't easy, the employees were able to gain confidence in technology as the bugs were worked out. Our equipment was transitioned to home, and familiarity with troubleshooting increased. And our relationship with IT was more critical than ever. Next slide. Shipping and mailing are a distinct part of our standard operating procedures. Shipping protocol is written into our sampling manual and into the lab's QA manual for receiving samples. Everything is standardized in written protocol involving chain of custody, shipping, and receiving practices. So we have nobody in the buildings to receive mail. Field operations were limited, but again, certain critical activities were being performed on a case-by-case basis. Luckily, at this time, feed samples were considered routine and we were not collecting them. But there were other mission-critical samples that were being obtained and received in Harrisburg. So with the regional offices being closed, the inspectors were responsible for mailing and for postage. We use a courier. We have a contracted courier, and we do not use the mailing system for submitting samples. Our contracted courier is able to pick up samples from anywhere, not just the regional offices. So the inspectors converted to having the courier come to their house to pick up the samples. However, the protocol dictated that shipping and receipt logs had to be maintained. Delivery schedules had to be worked out to correspond with a person being available to receive the shipment in Harrisburg. So much more effort had to be put into shipping that sample and making sure that someone was going to be in the Harrisburg office to get that sample and to sign it in properly. Next slide. And of course, it can't be overlooked how the professionalism of the entire staff increased to surpass expectations. So the employees, which include inspectors, the clerical staff, the managers, gained independence and adaptability. They demonstrated a confident and resilient staff, and we proved this to ourselves. Communications improved. We increased our efficiency on the use of time and other resources. So turning programs upside down really forced the chains of traditions to break. And we will come back to what makes sense, but we're not afraid to move on. Next slide. There are a few remaining challenges, and I look at these as possibilities for new opportunities. What will come of this? We have some critical training needs. We have inspectors that we have got to get to the FDA Classroom Series. We need on-the-job training for PC inspections. And at this point, all of that is halted. And I don't quite know what opportunity will present itself, but I'm looking for one. stockpiling PPE. We're still limited. How do we prepare for a possible increase in demand over winter? And of course, there's possibly more limitations to field and office. Just as we came out of those strict shutdowns and we're able to get back out into the field and to do more work, are we going to start to experience limitations again? We're going to have to modify our policies and manage our expectations again, but I'm hoping we can do this better this time. Instead of just shutting everything down, let's get back to understanding our mission critical work, get the buy-in from our leadership so that we can continue to investigate complaints, we can perform inspections as needed, and if needed, we can obtain samples and utilize the services of an outside lab for those high priority cases. But as always, it's important to work to meet our mission. Next slide. And there's my contact information. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Erin. Appreciate it. And just a reminder, there's a Q&A at the end, so please hold all questions until the end. And we are going to move on to our next presenter, and that is Jennifer Erickson here at the FDA. FDA COVID-19 experiences and stakeholder resources. Jennifer, take it away.
Good, thank you. So good afternoon or morning, wherever you are. I'm Jen Erickson with FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine in the Office of Surveillance and Compliance. Some of you may know me from, I've been here about 7 years, and I've been a regulatory counsel all the way up until this year. I've actually changed positions this year, and I'm now leading our preventive controls for animal food work as Jenny Murphy has moved on to being our new Deputy Director for Foods in our office. So a little change in role for me. Next slide, please. So with any emergency response, there's a few lessons that we knew and we learned again, and some lessons that we learned are things that we need to keep working on. So as COVID-19 unfolded, one of the primary takeaways that we've thought through in some of our reflecting back on how the first few months unfolded was that the ability to be flexible and adapt quickly is really key. It was really key both in our regulatory oversight and in our internal operations. At the beginning of this whole thing, there were a lot of very quickly moving puzzle pieces for industry and their need for regulatory flexibility to prepare for and address supply chain issues and disruptions with their ingredients and finished food, as well as plant supplies that they were trying to obtain for PPE. And then also for our operations, moving to a work-at-home situation, stopping our routine surveillance inspections, addressing staff challenges with childcare, and all of those things that we had to quickly get in order. And overall, our leadership and workforce has really been very receptive to meeting these challenges with flexibility and doing what we have to do to make things practical. And I think that that's been, the reason that we're in as good of a position as we are. Another thing, lessons learned, the importance of having those strong and long established relationships. As we've been working through all this flexibility and getting things changed to meet, the ever-changing needs, it's been really key to have already had longstanding relationships and regular contact with our stakeholders. It makes it much easier for us to pick up the phone and say, hey, this is what's going on, let's talk it through, and it makes it much easier for our stakeholders to pick up the phone and talk through challenges and figure out, where do we go next? And then I think another lesson kind of that we've learned is, disruptive changes, I think as Erin really nicely laid out, they give us some opportunities, right? So we've been really focused on, developing the animal food inspection program, in a post-FSMA world, getting a strong foundation for all of those activities. And halting everything this spring really gave us some time to step back and look at everything and say, how are we doing this? do we have to do it this way? Is there maybe a different way to do it? Are there some underlying things that now that we have a little bit of time, since we're not out doing inspections and supporting inspections, that we can kind of think through, oh, this is a good opportunity to get some of those pieces in place. It's also, in some ways, an opportunity to think about when you have very, very limited abilities to go out and do inspections, it really helps to clarify, what is really a priority, and refocusing kind of our efforts and attention to those bigger picture priorities. And so, through all this, we've gotten some time and ability to use our resources to kind of set up some of the infrastructure for some things in the future that we knew that we needed to eventually do, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then, as with any emergency response situation, we realize again and again the importance of having quality facility inventory data and being able to assess the impact of these events on particular facilities so that we can respond in an appropriate way and can respond in a way that, recognizes different parts of the industry may be experiencing different disruptions, and how do we handle that, and where do we need to focus our time and effort. So that's one of the areas that has been a long-standing thing is, having great data, being able to mine that, being able to figure out where things are at very easily, and it's a thing that we continue to work on. And it's also a thing that in some of our efforts we've really focused on getting some better data, collecting, using our inspector time to kind of collect some of that. So next slide, please. So a few of the things that we did from a policy perspective, especially towards the beginning of the pandemic, were some responses to requests for some temporary regulatory flexibility in order to especially address some of the supply chain disruptions that were happening. A few of the examples of types of things that we gave temporary enforcement discretion for was relaxing the on-site audit requirements, especially for things like supply chain and foreign supplier verification. There was also, this is probably more true in the human food world than the animal food world, there was, as the supply chain shifted from kind of a wholesale distribution to needing a more retail distribution, there was some food labeling flexibility that we gave so that people could make that transition with those foods and get them in an appropriate place so that they get used. We've also put out a few fact sheets and checklists to try to help our stakeholders as this unfolded. Again, early on when the supply chain disruptions were happening, especially in the human food world, we put out a fact sheet about safely distributing unused human food for use as animal food. Obviously, the human food manufacturers' main priority was getting these products to other human food uses, but we also knew that if there was not another human food use to go to, animal food was the next preferred option. So we tried to put something easy out there for them to use as a resource to figure out that if they weren't already typically doing that practice. And while this was originally developed to address the human food supply chain disruptions, all of the information in that fact sheet is something that applies generally in normal situations. So we think it's going to be a good resource for facilities, during normal practices as well when they might be wanting to send human food to animal food. More recently, we issued an employee health and food safety checklist for all human and animal food facilities, and I'm going to cover that a little more in depth on the next slide because I think that hasn't been around as long. So this is our newest resource that just came out last month, and stakeholders had noted for us challenges in incorporating all of the information that was coming from various sources like FDA, CDC, OSHA, and being able to take those and turn them into concrete actions at their facilities. And so this resource was the result of all of that. And the first section of the checklist really focuses on guidance regarding employee health that has primarily been issued by CDC and OSHA, really the stuff about COVID-19 and how to handle that in your facility. So it bundles the recommendations from these agencies that have the potential to really be relevant at our facility type. But it's FDA-wide, so it's anything from farms to human food manufacturers to animal food manufacturing. It covers a lot of facility types. So some of it might be appropriate for a facility, and some of it might be less appropriate at a different facility. It covers things like employee health checks, signage related to health practices, configuring worker spaces, and those other kind of recommendations to help reduce the spread of COVID within their workforce. And then the second section really focuses on the potential food safety impacts that might result from changes that were brought about by the pandemic, and things for the facility to think through. And this part is really based in our regulations, but it's how do you kind of think through the changes that have occurred at your facility and how that might impact your operations and compliance with the regulations. So things like, because of the supply chain disruptions, do I have different suppliers for my ingredients, or do I even have different ingredients? Are my employees working in different shifts? Are they running lines at different speeds? And do any of these changes kind of mean that I need to make some changes to my regular processes or practices to ensure food safety? So if a different person is monitoring, something that requires a preventive control because you have shift changes as a result of the pandemic, you need to make sure that they're trained to do that. If you slow down a production line because of personnel changes, and maybe there is some kind of control related to that production line, maybe you have to change some of your monitoring parameters, like all of those kinds of things that you need to think through. So please let us know if you have any feedback on this resource. CISPAN did hold a stakeholder meeting for their human food facilities to discuss it. We've checked in with our stakeholders and haven't heard of a need for our industry, but we're definitely happy to hold something if we hear that there is interest or confusion about the checklist that needs clarifying. Next slide, please. So a little bit about inspections for FY20. So, initially we also shut down inspections, and then in July, I believe we resumed our inspections. And I kind of wanted to give everybody an overview of kind of what we were doing with our inspector time during all of this. As we were thinking about what can we do off-site and what would help support some of that future program needs that we have. So during this time, our primary focus has really been on doing inventory cleanup and finishing existing work, such as closing out open inspections that were, kind of lingering as we first started working from home. We really have used this time, the animal food world we've been working on getting inspections and getting our inventory a little bit more together, as we now have FSMA, and that applies to maybe different facilities than we had visited in the past. And so this was really a golden opportunity for us to do inventory cleanup and to get just really a good handle on what our inventory is and who's doing what and subject to what requirements. It's really hard to do when you're focused on doing inspections, so it was nice to have the time to kind of put that foundation in. As we were restarting inspections, FDA put in a process to follow the gating criteria that was aligned in the plans for reopening America. Our inspectional areas have been divided up into kind of red, yellow, green areas based on the current COVID status. And in red areas, we prioritize our mission-critical inspections, so things like there's an imminent food safety risk, a recall or other event that could impact human or animal health. And then those were the only types of inspections we were performing in those areas. Any other inspectional time was spent on cleaning up our official inventory. And then in the yellow and green areas, we're performing both the mission-critical inspections as well as high-priority follow-up inspections. So, like, if there was a food safety issue recently and we're doing a follow-up inspection to verify that corrective actions have been implemented, those types of inspections are what we are doing. And at least for FY20, we only had a few months left for the rest of the fiscal year. And so we are doing the same thing in the green areas as we're doing in the yellow areas. There's very few green areas identified, and based on the area where there really wasn't a lot of work to do inspection-wise that was lining up with the available resources we had, so we decided to keep working on those inventory cleanup activities in those areas as well. One thing that I wanted to point out is that during these inspections, we are pre-announcing all of our inspections, whether it's mission critical or follow-up, and then when we get to routine, that is something that we're going to continue to plan to do. This is definitely different than our normal course of business, but we think it's something that's important to have those conversations in order to assess, what are some things that we need to keep in mind as we're coming into a facility while a pandemic is going on. We strongly encourage our state partners who are performing contract inspections to also pre-announce those inspections so that there's that consistency there. And if anybody would like copies of the script or the process that we use to pre-announce, definitely recommend that you contact your state liaison. They should have that information available for you. Right now, we're currently working on our plans for our inspectional activities for the next fiscal year. We anticipate that red, yellow, and green area designations will probably stay the same for some time. And we've committed to reviewing our approach to how we're going to do inspections and what we're going to do in each of those areas quarterly. And are looking at what are some other activities that might make sense to prioritize or we might be able to perform remotely as we're figuring out what we're doing for the next year. Next slide, please. So industry feedback. Just wanted to take a little bit of time to share with you what we've heard. We have definitely received some positive feedback on resources that we've developed with quick and easy to digest information. I mean, really what we're hearing from our stakeholders is it's really hard to follow all the things that are going on. And to the extent that it can be in like a quick, easy, bulleted list, that really helps us to figure out what to do with that information. We've also received some positive feedback on, our willingness to listen and work through these practical challenges that everybody's having and come up with some practical solutions. I think, like I mentioned at the beginning, lessons learned, those really strong relationships help to have difficult conversations as we're also working to sort through this, and that's definitely been appreciated. There are a few challenges that they continue to identify that we're going to keep in mind as we continue to work on COVID activities going forward. There's a lot of changing information to absorb, and so it's difficult to kind of figure out how to use this information, especially as we learn more about COVID, the information changes, and it's not always clear what's the most current resource or, what's an appropriate resource for my facility or situation. And so we're going to continue to try to figure out ways to make it clear and easy for facilities to find the information that they need. They've also noted some challenges in different information and approaches between regulators, whether that's between different federal agencies or state and federal. And so to the extent possible, as we're making decisions about what to do and how to communicate things, we're trying to keep in mind that, to the extent possible, we want to make sure we're giving as united of a front in information sharing as possible and then consistency about how we're doing things. So we definitely recognize that these are challenges. Sometimes there will be easy solutions and sometimes there won't to them, but the things we're going to continue to keep in mind as we try to provide, that clear and timely information and work with our partners to be as consistent as possible. Next slide. And that is my contact information and my cute dog, Jupiter. So.
It is a cute dog. Excellent. Thank you very much, Jennifer. I appreciate that. Okay. All right. We are going to move on to Austin Farrell with Coping with COVID. Take it away, Austin.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And again, I'm Austin Farrell. I'm the manager of the Feed Safety Department here at the South Carolina Department of Agriculture. And I'll just talk briefly about kind of how we've been impacted by COVID and how we have developed some hopefully creative strategies to continue routine work as best as we can that will hopefully set ourselves up for success in the post-COVID era. And I will say that, it has been nice for us. We have a dedicated standalone feed safety program and a lot smaller staff than some of these other states. So that has allowed us to have some more flexibility in making these changes and setting us up for success. Next slide. So kind of like how Aaron mentioned, the background here for us in South Carolina, Governor Henry McMaster issued Executive Order Number 11 on March 19th. That order directed all non-essential employees and staff in the state to work remotely, effective the very next day. So there's a real short turnaround time there. That gave us roughly a 3.5-month quarantine period where our entire staff was working remotely from home. In June, we began a 3-phase re-entry plan with essential employees reporting back to the office. And I will say during this time, some of our assistant commissioner and higher level staff, they did remain in the office, but most everyone else was reporting out. So from June to July, essential employees began reporting back. Phase 2 began for us on July 6th, where we had non-essential employees reporting back to the office on alternating schedules, keeping the building capacity below 50%. But that also allowed our inspectors to begin, they could resume field work again beginning July 6th. And also another decision was made for us specifically here at the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Protection that all employees and regulatory agencies began reporting back to the office full-time on August 17th. And so that's not applicable to all state agencies. So technically we're still in that phase 2. So phase 3 for everyone else in the state hopefully will be announced soon. Next slide. And so I briefly just wanted to mention and point out so I could show kind of the time difference here, but the FDA, the partial stop work order, was issued on March 20th, about the same time that we were told to work remotely in the state. So that was limited to 4 calls or emergency situations only, and it temporarily halted all routine surveillance inspections. And that partial stop work order was lifted on June 17th. However, from the previous slide, we had our state orders. We did not move into that phase 2 until July 6th. There was still a lag period there where our staff was still working remotely, even though technically we could resume those FDA contract inspections if we were able. Next slide. So some of the immediate impacts that were felt, obviously, canceled meetings, and not just the meetings that we all sometimes wish were canceled. Some of the bigger meetings like AAFCO seminar that we rely on go to every year, the AAFCO annual meeting, but those weren't technically canceled. They did move to a virtual format. And we really rely on sending staff to those bigger meetings for just, to count as continuing education, and a lot of that work kind of really drives some of the stuff we do behind the scenes throughout the year. So since that annual meeting was moved virtually, it still ended up working out for us, and I think that's probably going to be the same case coming up here in January. Canceled inspections, again, we were not able to do any of our FDA contract inspections or routine state inspections. And then also we had canceled audits from FDA, which really we were counting on. We had verification audits scheduled this year to hopefully get some verified auditors so we could move into phase 3 and conduct our own state audits. And with those being postponed, we're still stuck in phase 2 at the moment. That also canceled all our sample collection opportunities, which posed a problem for our feed lab, which relies on that, all of those samples. So, next slide. So what did we do? We shifted our focus to training virtual label reviews and registration virtually, updating our state inventory, and conducting outreach to firms. I did a surf time and then focused on the animal feed regulatory program standards. Next slide. So another kind of thing that hit us hard was right about the same time we began that quarantine period, we had a fully trained inspector that left to take another position elsewhere. So we were left having to fill that role and figure out how to train that person. Luckily, like Aaron said, we had finalized our basic and advanced training curriculum as required by AFRIP Standard 2. So our new hire inspector was able to complete all the online courses that are available through PassLore and ComplianceWire. She was able to complete 31 basic training courses and 15 advanced courses for a total of 46 out of our 53 required courses on our plan. And the remaining 7 courses are all face-to-face, which we're relying on, hoping on those face-to-face trainings will be either changed virtually or will happen sometime soon. It did give us an opportunity. A couple of those face-to-face courses are courses that we do in state, just such on our commercial feed law or sampling, and we did have the opportunity to kind of develop some of those courses and and decide how they were going to look. The other inspectors were able to retake some of those courses and kind of refresh knowledge that they had on labeling and the federal regulations and so forth. Next slide. One of the largest problems we had was trying to figure out how to handle product registration. In South Carolina, we require registration on all commercial feed products annually, and we do receive those electronically through the system we use. But we also still receive hard copies in the mail with labels. So with everyone working virtually, we had to figure out a process to get those to the people that needed to review them. Luckily, we were able to kind of set something up with one of those higher level essential employees that were still at the office to scan those documents in for our registration specialist to review. And they could kind of go back and forth with check numbers and get those documents to finance when everything was approved and had been reviewed. So it was a little bit tedious going back and forth with scanning and emails, but it worked out, and we were able to review and register a lot of products during that time. Another thing that our inspectors were able to help in that process a little bit. When companies register products in South Carolina, we have, especially with their when they do it electronically, we have those labels online, and inspectors were able to review and assist in reviewing about 150 labels, which really took some of the burden off of our registration specialists. And it also, I think, really benefited the inspectors for when they get back in the field and when they're looking at labels when they're out doing routine work. And they also utilize the ASCO OD online ingredient tool, which we have become real familiar with, and really it's been a great tool for us and our entire staff to get to use, and it really speeds up the review process to some extent. So next slide. One of the next things we focused on was just updating our state inventory and doing some outreach to firms. We had inspectors reach out to over 200 firms across the state. We updated contact information and point of contacts, and then we also gathered some COVID response data to inform our post-COVID inspection approach. Some of the questions that we asked are you open for business, which we had 100%. None of our businesses ever let us know that they were closing due to COVID or any other reason, so that was great. We asked if their hours had changed due to COVID so that we knew when we did resume routine field work if we were going to collect samples or going for another reason, if we needed to alter the times we go. We had about 34 firms that answered yes, with shortened hours. We asked about how many employees and if there were any new visitor policies that would impact our ability to conduct inspections when we resume them. And then some of the responses we've got were we had firms that recommended masks. Some were requiring masks, doing temperature checks upon entry, limiting visitors, and then social distancing us from employees. So they were just some of the general responses we got. But while we had firms on the phone, we were also able to remind them about FSMA requirements and upcoming PCQI courses that were being offered by Clemson University in the state. And that was real helpful, especially for our very small firms that are still struggling with that, with those requirements, and just being aware of what's required of them. Also, just we'll say that Clemson University did a great job during the time of they had some of those PCQI courses scheduled, and they moved them to a virtual format, and I really think that format was great for some of those very small businesses to be able to attend. The price was reduced, and they didn't have to leave their businesses for a couple of days, so it really worked out. Next slide. We also encouraged surf time during this time, where inspectors were at home in between training, and I know I probably speak for them when I say that there's only so many hours during the day you can work on online courses. So it's helpful to break things up a little bit, and we encourage the surf time for them to just go online and look for new businesses in their regions. It resulted in about 10 new businesses being added to our inventory, which were mostly pet treat businesses, and we found a lot of labeling errors. But we did find one brick and mortar location that had been making pet treats for 11 years with no inspection or registration history. So that was a good find, and that time was spent. It was really useful for us. Next slide. And then lastly, we were able to really take this time to slow down and reevaluate our feed program for the Animal Feed Regulatory Program standards. We're currently in year 4 of that 5-year grant, and we just used the time to see where we're currently aligning and where we're implemented already, where our gaps are, and where we need to continue to focus our time and energy to improve. We spent a lot of time writing new SOPs and reviewing our current procedures. And really, I think the main point I wanted to make here was that I feel like AFRIPS really set us up to be successful virtually. Just with the funding that we've been able to receive, we've updated technology. We now have the funding for virtual memberships like Zoom or GoToMeeting, and we were able to, to have those virtual staff meetings and call each other and do different things virtually when we had questions or things come up. So I really feel like AFRIPS set us up to be successful during quarantine, more so than not. So next slide. So future activities going forward, just from some of the things we've learned and doing some of this virtually and being flexible, was that the outreach phone calls to industry were great. I think anytime we can get on the phone with the businesses that we inspect and that we visit on a routine basis and just talk to them about what we do and what our jobs are and what our responsibilities are, it's great. We can never do that enough. So even now that we're back to routine work and we're back in the field, we're still going to make it a point to do some phone calls and reach out as much as possible. We learned that virtual label reviews were super helpful, especially when we have one registration specialist to register about 20,000 products. So having staff to kind of take on some of the burden to look at labels is something that I think we'll continue to do going forward. And then just overall having more connection with the inspectors, having weekly virtual staff meetings or monthly virtual staff meetings. Anytime we can connect and do that a little bit more, we think it's super helpful. Next slide. So there's my contact information. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Austin. I appreciate that. Okay. without further ado, we're going to move on to our last presenter, Hollis Glenn, work planning before, during, and after COVID-19. Take it away, Glenn, or Hollis.
Thank you, Anthony, and good afternoon or morning, everybody. My name is Hollis Glenn. I'm Director of the Inspection and Consumer Services here at the Colorado Department of Agriculture. And today, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on work planning for Colorado's feed program and look at it from what happened right before the COVID shutdown last spring, during the following months, and then when we began to then reopen up and start doing inspections again. And then I want to talk a little bit about kind of future and what we anticipate should we experience another shutdown again, either this fall or winter. Next slide. To begin, when COVID hit, we immediately identified that there were essentially 3 areas of the program that would be impacted, and the normal work, it would impact the normal work of the feed program, essentially the 3-legged stool of the program. We had the regulatory program staff, the office staff, we had the field inspectors, as well as laboratory staff as well. Beginning in March, there was what I like to call the fog of war effect, and I think we heard that also from the other presenters when this initially hit. Quite frankly, we did not know how long this was going to take. We were ordered to, one day we were asked to begin to bring everybody at home. We were going to be working from home. For how long? A week, 2, 3 weeks? It was hard to imagine at the very beginning that this was going to last more than a month. Little did we know. Nevertheless, we had to quickly shut it down, and we had to send home the inspectors with the proper resources. So we had to scramble for laptops for those in-office staff that had regular computers. We ordered cell phones for our administrative staff so they can do outreach to our customers, and customers can reach out to them without using their personal phones. At this point, PPE was just coming onto our radar, and we did not really have that immediate focus in those beginning first few days. But we did, like all the states I mentioned here, we had to scramble to find work for our inspectors. However, like the other states, we viewed it as an opportunity to begin to look for work for our field staff that could be done at home. Some of our initial concerns about the impact on the workload included, 1, how will this impact our ability to fulfill the FDA contract inspections? How will this impact our renewal season this fall? Should the shutdown occur in the fall, and how would we handle the volume of calls, the paperwork, the check processing, the payment processing from our administrative staff if they were still having to work from home? We also began to think larger picture of how would this from a long-term shutdown impact the feed supply chain, particularly those feed mills in Colorado that support Colorado ranchers. So in short, the very beginning held a lot of questions for the feed program: logistics, impact to staff, impact to industry, short-term concerns, and then the gradual realization that this might be a long-term impact that's going to impact the industry and the program. Next slide. Like other states, when the seriousness of COVID kind of sunk in, state leadership really began to coordinate a unified state response. Part of that response was a management plan that all the state agents part of that response was a management plan that all state agencies followed, and it started essentially from the governor down to the departments, down to the divisions, and then ultimately to the program and the program staff. So as far as the impact of conducting feed inspections and the workload and how that happened, the larger coordinated model that really worked and helped provide us to do an analysis of work and provided the program high-level guidance on actions that we needed to take specific to our programs. It helped with the actions that we needed to take, as well as the messaging that we need to be made, not just to our staff, but to our registrants. At the top was essentially the State Emergency Response Command. I hope someone's playing bingo. They might have gotten the child talking in the background. So at the top of the State Emergency Response, we we had an Emergency Response Command, which made up of key departments in the state system, emergency response coordinators, and they provided really the guidance that that impacted what we would do down to the feed program. On March 26, Governor Polis did issue a stay-at-home order, which lasted about a month, and then went into a second phase that we're still currently in, which is a work from home in April 26, and that phase is what we're still essentially in. I'm highlighting these high-level efforts as they pertain to the feed program for a few reasons. First, the stay-at-home work order really required non-essential businesses to stop and employees to remain at home. That is across Colorado, government agencies, private industry. However, there were business sectors that were considered essential and allowed to continue to operate, and one of those essential sectors was agriculture and the businesses that supported agriculture. Second, state leadership wanted state agencies to really set the example and having so employees remain at home as much as possible, not just from a public perceptive standpoint, but also for an employee safety. So even during the current executive order where we're allowed for a gradual reopening, state direction from leadership was set for state agencies was essentially still, we want employees to still remain working from home unless it's absolutely necessary. And then third, feed was recognized as a key link in the food supply, and as we were asked to relay to industry the kind of important information through the proper channels up to state leadership regarding any impact on the feed supply here in Colorado. Next slide. So diving deeper into the impact of the feed and the work planning and the impact of COVID, as a program, we had a decision to make. Feed mills were essential, considered essential business to remain open during operation during the pandemic, but was our inspections and our sampling critical to support their operations? On the other hand, we also had to take into account the direction of keeping our staff home as much as possible per the direction of state leadership. So what was the decision that we had to make, and what was the decision we did make? Ultimately, we determined that we would suspend feed inspections during the stay-at-home order for a few reasons. Number one, the health and safety of our inspectors. Two, relatively low chance of identifying any critical observations or adulterated feed. And three, there was a real concern that our presence at a feed operation could delay the operations of that feed mill, particularly if we were to expose their employees to COVID. At that time, feed mills were operating basically 24 hours a day, keeping up with supply, and the last thing we wanted to do was come in there and interrupt those operations. This is at the same time when here in Colorado and in the country, we started to see the impact of COVID in the meat processing plant. So impacting feed operations became a real concern for us. We determined that because feed was essential, we would still investigate complaints that came into the department in the interest of consumer protection. So complaints were left on the table, so to speak, for inspectors to go out and conduct inspections during the stay-at-home order. We documented this decision to halt inspections or suspend inspections in an SOP that outlined the work we'd be doing and outlined the work we would not be doing during that stay-at-home order. The development of that SOP really provided guidance not only to our inspectors, but it also alerted the department and the department's leadership on what the status of this program was at any given time. It's important to note that we use inspectors, our inspectors do inspections for other programs. So we had to make this decision. We weren't necessarily in a vacuum, but we had to make this decision about rescheduling inspections and the inspection workload, not just with the feed program, but with multiple other programs as well. So we had to work across programs to come up with these final decisions and strategies of what we'd be doing during the shutdown order. Finally, we felt like we made the right decision to suspend and reschedule feed inspections when the partial stop work order from the FDA came out regarding the FDA contract inspections. Next slide. So we froze our inspections and we grounded our feed staff, and that included the laboratory staff, the administrative staff, and the field inspectors. And as mentioned earlier, we had to figure out the technology needs and provide them the necessary equipment for them to work at home. For work and for the inspectors, we really had to reimagine what the inspectors could do, much like Pennsylvania and South Carolina. And with inspectors at home, we had them assist staff with label reviews. Label reviews was an excellent duty or an excellent job to assign to inspectors, because it really helped those inspectors, particularly the relatively new inspectors that we had on staff, really improve their knowledge of labeling requirements, and it allowed the administrative staff to get through a ton of label reviews and really identify some of the labels that were problematic that needed to be addressed. We took the time also for our inspectors we took the time with the inspectors in the field to really review our SOPs, particularly on feed inspections and feed samplings and other relevant SOPs to update those SOPs and really kind of fine-tune them going forward. And we also set up our inspectors to do refreshing training. We utilized FDA PathLore, so we made sure everyone had a PathLore account. And we also then utilized the AFTO free trainings, and take a moment to especially thank AFTO for those trainings that they made available free to the public. They were very informative, very educational, and a lot of CDA employees beyond the feed program really did take advantage of those AFTO trainings. It was also important that we stayed in contact with our staff to help keep morale up. So we had frequent check-ins with our staff. We held virtual happy hours as well as various trivia games, just to keep the connection and that bond going between the staff as we waited out the stay-at-home order. Next slide. So getting back into the field, in early May, the stay-at-home order was effectively lifted here in Colorado, and we began to explore what we would need to do to get back into that field. And for us, the key was really needing to develop a COVID-specific protocols and memorializing those in a COVID SOP. Key elements of that SOP included how staff were going to monitor their temperature. We talked at this point, PPE became a big element to what we needed to focus on. So we have PPE inventory and protocols on developing our inventory, as well as guidance on how to properly use PPE. We developed PPE inventory levels, so we make sure that we have a certain base amount of gloves and masks and hand sanitizer for each inspector, and when those get low, it triggers essentially a notification to our procurement office so they can then begin to procure more PPE to maintain those inventory levels. We emphasized the importance in the development of travel logs. When we did open up, we had a large backlog, so we had to prioritize our inspections and what were the mission critical or the first inspections that we needed to focus on to support the various industries that we inspected. And then most importantly, we needed to develop a contact log for our inspectors. In case an inspector does come down or contract COVID-19, we need to be able to trace back where that inspector was at and who they were in contact with. Inspectors' concerns and safety was also important. Some of our inspectors would be considered at risk or maybe live with somebody that is at risk or immune compromised, and that was a serious concern for the program and for the department, frankly. We didn't want to make inspectors go out if they were not comfortable and be in high traffic areas if they were, again, kind of considered high risk or have real serious concerns for them or their family about contracting COVID. And as a result, and when that happened, and we had a few of those, we would modify their work schedule to accommodate those concerns. So we'd redistribute the workload in that territory, and again, we'd have them avoid high traffic areas, or we'd have them work from home a little more than just being 100% in the field. Travel restriction was also a big obstacle for us to look at when we got back into the field. So we stayed away from high traffic areas, not just high traffic facilities, but high traffic areas or certain parts of the state. There were areas of the state that we simply could not go because either they had high cases of COVID-19 being reported or they had limited hospital resources, and the governor was literally requesting anyone and everyone to stay away from those particular counties, and particularly the ski areas, which have high populations during the ski season, but very low hospital resources. We did reduce overnight trips for our inspectors to avoid unnecessary hotel stays. So we allowed for longer inspection days. So our inspectors would work 4 10-hour days and travel further distance to complete an inspection that they normally would be staying overnight. They would complete those inspections and then drive back home. We'd also allow for that essentially did create or result in more drive time, more windshield time, increased mileage, which is an increased expense to the program. But nevertheless, based on the concern for inspector safety and the need to minimize travel of our inspectors, we feel that added cost, those extra miles, those if going to a certain part of the state twice versus staying overnight is better for everyone. We did enhance our approval process for travel so we can monitor when our inspectors are going out there. We have also developed travel protocol to have inspectors avoid riding in cars together, having more than one inspector in the car, and other kind of sort of areas just to make sure that when we did travel, we were in line with kind of the COVID-19 best practices that were being released by the state. Next slide. When we did get back into the field, we also had to take a look at our sampling efforts and make adjustments. I mean, with the shutdown, quite frankly, the staff were struggling to find work. They were twiddling their thumbs a little bit. You can only review so many protocols so often. So because of this backlog of inspections, the restrictions in travel, we implemented a slow ramp-up initiative of our sampling starting in July 1, which is normally when we start a new sample plan for the fiscal year. Laboratory program staff and field staff met and worked on adjusting what the sample plan schedule would look like. Again, we started off small, we started off low, and have slowly ramped up through the summer. We also had to refresh our inspectors on sampling protocols, particularly the new inspectors. So when we did start ramping up our sampling, we really assigned those first samples to be taken in July to our most seasoned inspectors and let the newer inspectors focus on other inspection programs until they had kind of a refresher training and a refresher on how to conduct sampling and also putting it into the system. There were also scares and concerns related to COVID-19 in field and inspectors getting back into the field, namely, what were we going to do if an employee was exposed to COVID? And this scare, honestly, seems to impact our programs almost on a weekly basis. Now, we have, fortunately, knock on wood, we haven't had any of the inspectors contract COVID, but we've had a number of close calls where inspectors have been in close proximity or close contact with somebody that may have contracted COVID. And so nevertheless, for those close calls, we had to develop department protocol on self-quarantine those employees based on guidance that we received from leadership. This is a tricky situation because we have to negotiate how do we address this situation in line with kind of HR lead policy. We can't have necessarily every inspector, if they've had a close call, self-quarantine and be removed from the field or removed from work altogether for 5 to 14 days. That could possibly eat up into their sick leave or their annual leave, but yet at the same time, we don't want them necessarily sitting at home on administrative leave duty. So we have to balance that out with ensuring the inspector that may be exposed to COVID is safe, removed from the field, but also in line with HR leave policy. Next slide. We're going to take a little minute and digress a bit about and talk about one interesting side note that I want to share, which was the inclusion of the feed program in the department's feed security task force. This task force was set up to essentially identify processing pain points in the processing of the food supply, again, as a result of issues that we're seeing on farms and issues we're seeing in meat processing facilities. And they, from the jump, included the feed program as a result and to be part of this food security task force. And in that, the feed program, the program manager regularly met with the food security task force on a weekly basis. They would contact the industry to monitor the impact of COVID and brought any issues up regarding the feed supply up to the task force and then up to informed leadership. Next slide. Next slide. So we have to prepare for the long term. And one of the key initiatives that we did, Colorado did regarding work planning, was to develop a long-term strategic plan and assessment in May when we really didn't know how long this was going to last. And in our plan, we ran scenarios that the scenarios would basically state that what would happen if we had to shut down the program for 2 months, for 6 months, or for 12 months. And we assessed that impact based on the seasonality of work. Shutting down the program in the fall is significantly different than shutting it down in the winter. And we looked at the budget, and we looked at how certain elements of the program were going to be impacted if we were to be shut down in those time frames. And we looked at budget, we looked at the impact on staffing, policy changes that we'd have to make, industry outreach that would need to be done, impact on office work as well as our field work. And through that strategic plan, we realized that serious impacts of the program were essentially going to occur in between months 6 and months 12, in which working at home for field would be, in which finding work at home for our field staff, quite frankly, is going to be hard to come by. And the office staff would also be challenged in conducting renewal season this fall if we're going to have to work from home, which does indeed look like this is going to be the case. Fortunately, our analysis did show we have little impact on the overall revenue as it pertains to the number of registrants and products that we believe are going to be registered. We believe that the impact of COVID-19 is going to have a nominal impact on the budget revenues of the program through the registration process. But in conducting our strategic plan assessment, we found that I just want to add that through conducting our strategic plan assessment, we found that the resource analysis exercise from Standard 8 in the AFRPS was really helpful and provided the feed program in particular a leg up in doing these analysis and looking at the various resources that needed to be focused on that may be impacted should we see a continued shutdown. We're glad to have this plan. We're glad to have this plan essentially in our back pocket right now should we see another shutdown this year. Next slide. So what does the future look like in regards to work planning, particularly if we're going to see a surge this winter? As I mentioned, we identified 2 key pain points for the CDA feed program. 1, renewal season starting here in November, and then 2, what would we do for work for our inspectors? We're currently working on making the adjustments on the renewal process. We're working on call forwarding. We are allowing we're staggering our staff to come into the office to handle in-person application processes, paper processing. However, finding work for our inspectors at home, should they have you shut down for another 6 weeks, 2 months, is going to be difficult. And honestly, I don't know if I have the answer on what we would do with these inspectors. Through coordinated effort from state leadership, Colorado is conducting a statewide hot wash of lessons learned from this spring. For the feed program, again, that 2, 6, and 12-month strategic plan, and then the COVID SOP that we developed was really critical in addressing staff work before, during, and then after the work stoppage. So for us, the takeaway from doing that hot wash is having a strategic plan for a long-term doomsday scenario, as well as codifying the SOP-specific stuff in an SOP. From a long-term perspective, we'll need to be prepared for possible budget cuts, not being able to fill vacancies in the program, and possible state furloughs. And all of these three elements might also impact how we are going to do our work planning for the feed program. And we're going to need to begin to think about, and we are beginning to think about, what are our contingency plans if we're not going to be able to fill vacancies for an inspector in a particular territory, or what's going to happen if we do see budget cuts to the program. These are contingency plans that the feed program, as well as, quite frankly, the entire department is starting to look at, and these are very important to do. I want to go back a little bit and talk a little bit more about the inspectors and if they have to work from home. And I mentioned a second ago that I don't have the answer, and this is something that I would probably want to maybe point out or put out to the group rhetorically, is that this is probably something that is going to impact a number of our state programs, our feed programs across the country. And the more we can think about, the more ideas that we can share regarding finding work for our inspectors on home, whether it is feed label reviews, possibly conducting virtual inspections, trainings, the more we can cooperate and communicate among the agencies, among the programs, the better off I think we'll be to help finding answers and finding work for these inspectors. So I think it is really potentially going to be a big problem going forward. But in summary, I think that Colorado, like most of the other states, did a great job in adjusting and coming up with a balance between keeping our employees and our communities safe during the impact of the COVID shutdown, without falling too far behind in our work that we are charged to complete. There are a lot of good lessons to be learned as we adopt the new normal. Should we see another surge and another state shutdown, we should be able to apply these lessons and refine our responses. And I want to thank Partnership for Food Protection and AAFCO for putting this webinar together. And I believe that these discussions across the state to share these lessons learned are really going to help our programs prepare for what's to come. Next slide. And with that, I want to thank everyone and wish everyone a good afternoon.
Excellent. Thank you, Hollis. I really appreciate that, sir. And thank you to all of our speakers for your presentations. We are now in that portion of our call where we will take questions from our callers. So please utilize WebEx and raise your hand, or you can type a question in the chat box, and I will do my best to get to it. So go ahead if you have any questions, anyone.
And Tony, this is Barbara. Maybe while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions, I had a few submitted ahead of time. I think Pat might have too. If I could start out and thank all the speakers, that was excellent, exactly what we were looking for. I'm going to direct this question to Jen, but anyone can chime in and answer it. Jen, what was one of the most surprising or difficult inquiries you had from either industry or state agency around handling the COVID? And then the add-on to that, I'm sticking two together, were there any ingredient shortages?
For the first question, I think one of the most difficult, and actually this kind of answers both of them, I think one of the most difficult things that we ended up working through just as an agency as a whole was some of the supply chain disruptions and the issues surrounding that and figuring out where those shortages might be or where those transitions needed to be. And that was also kind of the biggest thing that we had to work through. So figuring out, especially I think, for the animal food world, the change in driving factors affecting DDGs that were coming out of our ethanol plants and stuff like that was probably the most disruptive ingredient supply chain in the animal food world, but then there was, of course, a number on the human food side as well.
Thanks,
Thank
Jennifer. And I got a question in too, Barbara. As far as a lot of changing working environments for your employees, and so wondering if there was any challenges that you had with any of your union or collective bargaining agreements. Any employees start kind of pushing back on your revised protocols and how you're doing that, and how you might have addressed that at the state level.
Who was that directed to, Pat?
Anyone can answer. That's fine.
Okay.
Any of our speakers.
This is Hollis. I could go ahead, Austin.
Hollis, you can go ahead, but I'll be quick. I was just going to say we didn't really have any kind of problems with staff or run into any of those type of situations. Everyone was and at least in South Carolina for us was extremely flexible as the situation was fluid, and really we made a lot of changes real quickly, and everyone adapted, and so that goes to say a lot for us and our staff. But yeah, we didn't run into anything like that.
Yeah, this is Hollis in Colorado. I would echo that. We just recently, beginning in this few months, have unionized state employees, so they're just that whole process wasn't really a factor when COVID first hit. But I would say that the state's response has been very accommodating to employees' health and safety and concerns, has been very much at the forefront of any decisions that were being made, either from the high level or down to the programmatic level, regarding putting any of these employees in an uncomfortable position. And we always erred on the side of caution and focused on their safety first.
Excellent. Any questions come in, Anthony?
I do not see any hands raised or questions in chat. So if I'm missing anything, speak up, anyone. But I think we're good right now.
Okay, Barbara, do you have any others that came in?
Yeah, I got a couple more that came in to me. Working from home during a pandemic offers personal and emotional challenges, especially for as long as this has been going on for a lot of us. Hollis, you shared some things that you all did to engage your employees, and I wondered if anyone else had something extra to share for the group.
Hey, Barbara, this is Erin Bug. I'll take a stab at that. So that was a challenge. There was a definite need for outreach, checking in with employees, and it wasn't just limited to the inspection staff. People that were very used to working together, having the opportunities to talk face-to-face, were no longer near, and everything was relegated to an email conversation, which became very difficult, actually. You'd think that you would get used to doing that, but it actually created some barriers in communication. And I think that what happened was, individually, you just had to take the time to reach out. Unfortunately, I didn't get to do anything cool like Hollis did, which was virtual happy hour or, games with some of the employees. But, we took our time. We reached out to people individually. I know I did at certain times. I took one person at a time, sent them an email, checked in with them. We did host some conference calls so that they could ask questions. I worked closer with the supervisors of the regional inspection staff so that they could carry the message. I checked in with our clerical. Obviously, our program specialists were two people that I was working very, very closely with daily. I don't feel that the relationship that I had with the program specialist suffered in any way, and in many cases, I felt like it transcended beautifully, the challenges of not seeing each other in the office, but in fact solidified the really good working conditions that we had together.
Thank you for sharing that. Others?
Hey.
This is Erickson. A few things we've done a lot of similar things as Hollis mentioned, but a few other things that we've done is we've done some focused conversations around some of the challenges that employees are having, dealing with child care issues and parenting during this situation, especially as schools are coming back online during the workday, having everybody at home dealing with that. So we've tried to make some space for those kinds of conversations to have people, either share their venting or share tips and tricks. And another thing that we've kind of been talking about recently, at least with our team, is at the beginning of the pandemic, we were very good about having those kind of more social interactions and being intentional about it. And as time has gone on, the work has kind of consumed some of that. And so refocusing on doing some of that, because it was very helpful to kind of keep those things going and have those kind of organic conversations that you're used to having when you're around the office. So those are a few of our experiences.
Excellent. And Hollis, I saw that picture of all the toilet paper piled on the dining room table. Was that your table?
No, mine had three rolls of toilet paper on it.
I just need to know where to go next time the event happens. So I was a little short and was coming up with some pretty disgusting alternatives. So it was touch and go for a while.
If you Google funny COVID work from home pictures, that's what you get. Computers on toilet paper.
There you go.
Perfect.
Hey, we did receive one other question here from our audience. So has anyone performed any COVID checks at businesses to ensure they're following their state or federal guidelines? What authority did you use to conduct these inspections, and have you come across any challenges if you did that? That'd be for any of our speakers here today.
This is Hollis. No, we did not. And I would just say anecdotally, that was something that kind of came up from a larger perspective, not just in the feed program, but it was who has the jurisdiction or the authority to enforce a governor's executive order. And that really fell to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Safety, so a completely different agency. So we were very hands-off on that issue.
Austin, Aaron, any other input on that? Did you guys go out and do any COVID business checks?
We have not been doing, I'm sorry, Austin, I'll make this quick. We have not been doing any of the COVID mitigation checklists or follow-ups. However, the Pennsylvania Department of Health has recently asked us to participate in one specifically that they're having a very hard time reaching, and they're not getting any sort of feedback from the facility. So they have put a request into us, since we have an established relationship with the firm, if we could help to complete the mitigation checklist and to assist them in their outreach. That is still pending. We're trying to figure out how best to do that, because like everything, we have to walk that line of what is our regulatory authority given to us, and can we operate with this request on an outreach only, and participate as requested by our partner, which we would really like to do, but we do have to follow this thread here to find out what we can do to help.
Austin, anything else to add?
Nope. I was just going to be short and sweet and just say that conversation did not come up with us at all either. I think in our state it would fall to our Department of Health and Environmental Control, which is a separate agency. So we didn't have to cross that bridge, luckily.
Very good. I will offer one comment after listening to other webinars, with manufactured food and retail and others. I thought it was very interesting that AFREP's, your program standards came up a couple of different times in the different presentations and their utility and use. And I think one of the things, I think it was Hollis that mentioned, not sure what we're going to do with staff if we have to shut down again, if we have a second wave that comes through and we have to be more restrictive in terms of employee movement. But I did hear some programs mention, kind of using that opportunity to kind of bolster their efforts on program standards. go back and kind of update and review their, everything from inspectional procedures to emergency response procedures, and look at that, and also look at their websites and, any of their information that's on the websites. Those often go, unreviewed. I could speak from personal experience when I was in the regulatory world. We're really good at posting information. We're not really always very good at going back and policing it, updating it, and making sure that it's still current and fit for use. So at least from some of the other stuff, just kind of throw that out there for everybody as some general ideas if you are still looking for things down the road for your staff to work on that'll help you still move your program in a very positive direction. But I don't have any more questions, Barbara. Do you have anything else in your queue there?
No, mine's clean. How about you, Tony?
No, ma'am. I think we're done.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for hanging in with us. Excellent, excellent presentations, everyone. Pat, do you want to kind of wrap it up?
Yeah, I just want to thank our speakers and all of our attendees for taking time out of their very busy schedules to come and listen and share today. We appreciate that, and we certainly appreciate all the efforts that all of your programs are doing during this tough time. We hang together and we work together. We'll continue to ensure the safety of the human and animal food supply. So everybody keep up the good work and stay safe out there, and we will hopefully get back together soon. So that's all I have. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Pat. And I'll just add a copy of the recording and the presentations will be posted on the PFP website. If you have any additional follow-up questions or comments, please email them to either our presenters or to pfp@fda.hhs.gov. And that concludes today's call. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.